Today I wanted to do a video just kind of discussing one of my favourite studies in psychology history. I studied this at GCSE, A-level and now at degree level, and this study is quite relevant in terms of understanding obedience, and it's Milgram's study into situational obedience, which is defined as like compliance with an order of request by law or a person of authority. But this study questions what about when obedience goes too far, and Milgram in 1963 was very interested in obedience in extreme circumstances, so he used the example of the Nazi regime in Germany in 1941 to 1945. The main aim of this study was to see if people put in a circumstance of extreme stress and would administer shocks to another participant who was considered innocent in the situation, and it was a random luck of the draw of which one was going to be in the situation. The method of this study was a controlled observation. It was conducted in Yale University, prestigious, it's considered very respectable, and he compared it to another situation of a run-down abandoned building to see how obedience level would differ. But in this video we're just going to talk about the main experiment that he conducted. A controlled observation is defined as when researchers observe behaviours in a controlled environment, and so there was a lot of controls put in place that we will discuss later. The participants of this study were 40 males who were aged 20 to 50 of different careers from the New Haven area. These people were collected through an advertisement published in the local newspaper asking for men to take part in a memory study. They were offered $4 to take part in the experiment. They eventually were given $4.50, as Milgram discusses in his original research, and they were told that when they arrived that this money would be given to them no matter what happened in the situation, no matter what happened in the study. Through the idea of the advert, this means that they were recruited through volunteer sampling. Volunteer sampling is when the participants self-select themselves to take part in the research. It's usually considered one of the most ethical forms of sampling because it ensures complete consent to make sure that there's transparency in the situation, which this study doesn't have a lot of. Hi, I'm just popping in here editing just to clarify. Volunteer sampling creates complete consent to take part in the observation. There can be observations that happen where you don't consent to take part. Big issue of this study is that it does lack consent from the participants to take part in this specific study. They signed up for a memory study. This study lacks informed consent, just to clarify. Cool. So moving on to actually how the study goes. The study begins with a participant who was one of the actual participants and a confederate. The confederate was called Mr. Wallace. A confederate is an actor within research who's there to try and push the story along and to help with the authenticity, so the subject or participant does believe what's going on. These two were greeted by an experimenter, treated exactly the same as two participants. The actual participant was made to believe that this confederate was another one of the participants, and it was decided that they were going to be split into learner and teacher. This was decided through a pull of a slip from a hat, in reality both of which said teacher, because it was rigged to make sure that the participant who was the actual participant got the role of teacher and the confederate always got the role of learner. Then after this interaction they were taken into another room where the learner, the confederate, we're going to refer to them as learner from now on because it's a bit easier to differentiate between learner, who's the confederate, and teacher, who is the actual participant. So the learner and the teacher were taken into this room while the experimenter strapped up the learner into a shock machine. It was an electric shock kind of apparatus designed to look like a death row electric shock chair. As the learner was being strapped into this electric chair, the teacher was told a series of things about the chair. They were told that the electrode that was being strapped to the learner was connected to a room next door that the teacher would then go into to help do the shocks. In this room the teacher could not see the learner but they could hear them. The experimenter also told the learner and the teacher that the shocks, although extremely painful, could not cause permanent tissue damage, and this phrase was also included as a special prod and we'll get onto the prods later. To understand the timeline of this research, it's important to separate the cover story from what the actual story was. So as discussed earlier, the cover story was a memory test, and that was what they were told when they volunteered and throughout the entire experiment. The cover story of memory was that the learner was to try and learn a series of words through punishment of electric shocks. That's what the teacher was told. There was little research Milgram discussed in his original publication of this. There was little research into this area, so it was very plausible that this study was not, it could have been groundbreaking if it was a real study. It wasn't like something that was well researched in 1962, 1963 when this took place. So I'll now just delve into like what actually happened in the study, so the cover story and what that led to throughout the study. As told before, they could not see the learner, but they could hear the learner and would get their responses to the questions through a little strip that would tell them which one that they indicated. They were given a list of word pairs, and so it would be one word plus another word, and that was the word pair. The teacher would read out the list of word pairs in one go, and then they'd go one by one, say the first word of the word pair, and give an option of 4 to the learner of which other words could have been, like a multiple choice option, for which of the words could be related to the other word. If the learner would pick the correct answer, the participant or the teacher would tell them that it was correct and move on to the next word pair. If the learner was told that it was an incorrect answer, they were told that it was incorrect, they were told the voltage that they were going to be shocked by, and then given the shock. And after each shock, the teacher moved on to the next shock level. The shock generator, which was placed in the other room as mentioned, that had 30 lever switches, and they were just like little switches that you just, and it would go down, and they could track which voltage they were up to as they were going along, so they didn't go back on one and stuff. Each lever was labelled with like which voltage it was, from 15 to 450 volts. And these volts on the levers were in 15-volt increments, and that's important for understanding where people stopped and what happened at each increment. These levers on the machine were separated into different categories. Now, I didn't mention this earlier because it was important to understand the actual story before I went back and said this, but prior to the study beginning, to help with the authenticity of the study, which is part of the controlled element, the participant, the teacher, was given a sample shock. It was just a little shock, it was the third one on the board, and it was 45 volts, and it was kind of just to show that the shock machine worked and how painful the shocks actually were. The important part of what Milgram wanted to research was the effect of an authority figure on the research, and as I mentioned of the prods before, there were 4 prods that the participants were given if they wanted to stop shocking the other participant, the Confederate. The first prod was please continue or please go on. Obviously there will be a bit of variation in some of the words that are said, so these were the main 2 that were said. The second prod was the experiment requires that you continue. The third prod, getting a bit more pressure on from the experimenter to obey the situation, was it's absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, the fourth prod was that you have no other choice, you must continue. The progression of the 4 prods shows obedience levels of saying that you must continue from an authority figure led, as we'll see in the results, majority, almost all, to continue all the way. And these participants didn't really understand that they had the free will to physically stop pressing the buttons, and figured that, well, this person's telling me to obey, so I must. For this research, it was important for Milgram to try and get a wide range of results, and so he separated them into the quantitative findings and the qualitative findings. Quantitative findings, which is basically just numerical findings, he listed the voltage that people went up to, and that was the main quantitative finding. This was a very qualitative study. The qualitative findings included the reactions to the different things that were said from the Confederate, the reactions of what was said to the experimenter, and also the physical reactions, as you'll see, that quite a lot of the participants ended up having. An important piece of information that I also didn't say earlier, because it's important to understand the Confederates' role and the learner's role within the study, is that the Confederates' role actually ended when the teacher was taken into the other room and they couldn't see them. To keep the opinions and noises and everything standardised, they wanted to make sure that everything was consistent and reliable across every participant. So instead they used a recording of different responses by Mr. Wallace that was given to each specific voltage increment. The Confederates' responses to the different voltages were standardised across what voltage it was. So each participant would have the same response at each voltage, and want to make that clear. So the main things that happened was the Confederate would, at certain points, would lower down in the thing, would start with just going, ow, that hurts. As we got further up, they'd be like, I don't want to do this anymore, I don't want to continue. And they'd have to keep continuing. As you get further on, the pain noises get louder, they get more aggressive, and eventually at 315 volts it leads to the Confederate going silent. Just before you hear the silence, you do hear the Confederate saying, I have a heart condition, and this was just to try and sell to the participants the danger of them continuing to obey the authority figure, and the silence was to indicate some form of either death or unconsciousness from the Confederate. Following this entire experiment, before I get into the results, it was important to note that each participant was given a debrief at the end of the experiment. Despite a lot of the ethical issues in this study, they were reunited with Mr. Wallace and were given the opportunity to ask questions. They were given a post-experiment interview, and it was just to make sure that everything was cool, that they were sound, everything was good. The first finding is something that I find quite interesting, is in the post-experiment interview, is that the participants were asked, how painful do you think the last few shocks were? They were asked to rate on a rating scale from 0 being not painful at all to 14 very painful. Extremely painful is the words that Milgram actually used. And when you look at the results, it was 13.42 was the average reported scale. And that's how high people thought these shocks were to the other participant, and it kind of showed to the participants how far they were willing to go. Moving into the actual qualitative and quantitative results of the actual experiment. It's not actually an experiment, it's an observation, but they call it an experiment throughout, and Milgram did many different iterations of the study, so if I say experiment, I apologise. There are two main qualitative results that I wanted to go into, and that was regarding the reactions given by the different participants. There was reported a high number. Milgram seemed, when you read his report of the initial study, he seemed very shocked at the amount of nervous laughter that was coming out of these participants. 14 out of 40 participants went into nervous laughter, and Milgram stresses during his research that this laughter, as shown in the post-experimental interviews, this laughter wasn't coming from a sadistic place, it wasn't coming from enjoyment, it was nervous, it was uncomfort, it was stress. Milgram describes that he witnessed 3 uncontrollable, full-blown, is the words he used, full-blown seizures going on from the stress of this situation of having to obey the authority figure and cause pain across another person. And that's one of the main results that'll show you that this was not an ethical study. They said that one of the seizures they had to halt the experiment, they had to call an ambulance and make sure that this person was okay. It was the 60s, we get it. Many other research is especially in the social psychology area, very unethical because of the time period that it was conducted in. In terms of the quantitative results, it's important to know where people got up to, and in the original study, just before it, Milgram did a bit of a preface. He kind of said of how likely he thought people were going to be to actually go to 450 volts, the highest voltage, and he estimated it between 1 to 3% of the participants. Milgram stressed that there was no conceivable way that these participants could have been going up to 450 volts, knowing that at 315 volts that it appeared that Mr. Wallace, the Confederate, the learner, had become unconscious, and that 100% of participants went to 300 volts. As I mentioned, 315 volts was when there was extreme stress from Mr. Wallace, and he became silent at that point. He'd said he had a heart condition and that these shocks were incredibly painful. He'd become silent at 315 volts. The fact that 100% went to 300 volts, they needed a man to go unconscious to realise that this was wrong. And also, you go further into the study, at that point of 300 volts, only 5 participants actually refused to continue. At this point of the study, Milgram reports that they all had the same level of defiance. They were all questioning the experimenter, saying this man is unconscious. But only 5 out of 40 decided at this point at 315 volts to not continue with the study, despite them all having the same reactions to the research. And I think that is mental. Finally, getting to the bit you've been waiting for, 65% of the participants went to 450 volts, which was the maximum voltage. And again, want to stress, this was not happy. Milgram said that once they reached the 450 volts and the experimenter brought it to a halt, they had a huge sigh of relief. They were rubbing their eyes. They were so glad that it was over. So that's kind of the study of Milgram's social psychology approach to obedience, explained in a nutshell. It was probably quite long. Despite its unethical, very unethical by modern standards, research in causing immense amount of distress and not adhering to protection of participants, this study was groundbreaking in understanding social psychology and earning both a bit of respectability for psychology in the amount of research we can find from conducting experiments like this, and the amount of respectability psychology lost that it already didn't have because of the stress that it caused. As groundbreaking as these results are, to look at that number of 65% went to 450 volts is something that we cannot take with a pinch of salt. You can't look at that and think, well, that was a select few 40 people, because these people came from a range of professions. There was blue collar and white collar workers, there was unemployed people, there was a mixture of people to try and show how, given the right circumstance, given the right situation, anyone can turn to violence. And that was Milgram's main plan with this research, was to try and understand how an innocent, law-abiding citizen can turn into a monster and create excessive violence that just by being told to. And so thank you for watching that video. It was a study that I have loved, not for the amount of pain it caused on people, but because of how important it was. I love social psychology, and so I'll probably do more, even though I'm not doing a psychology degree. I'm doing criminology, sorry. But I think that these studies are the most interesting because they're unethical. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. If you have studied psychology before, you will have no doubt studied this. I wanted to start with a very interesting study that I have learned for the last 5 years and still can read it and not be bored of it. And if you are new to psychology and understanding some of the studies that help us get to how we understand people, then welcome. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all soon, hopefully. Bye!